We'll go now to look at Southeast Asia. And Martin, we just had an announcement literally in the last few minutes from the Japanese Parliament, but for the first time since the Second World War, they have voted that they will be able to use Japanese armed forces outside Japan. That's literally just in the last few minutes they've announced that.
Well, that's because of pressure from the US, because they want to have wars. There is a war developing between Russia, China, Iran and the Western powers, and Japan is very much in the pocket of the Americans.
Anyway, I spoke also to Professor Bilveer Singh, who's political science at Singapore University, about the whole security situation over in Southeast Asia.
I'm Bilveer Singh. I teach in the Department of Political Science, National University of Singapore, and I'm also an Adjunct Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore, Nanyang Technological University. In the National University, I'm a political scientist. I teach mainly on security politics of the region, great powers, as well as the regional powers, plus terrorism. But in the Rajaratnam School, I do a lot of action research on terrorism, mainly in Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, in terms of de-radicalization and counter-radicalization.
So are you actually able to gather fresh new information, or are you just recycling other people's?
Both. I think you need both. There's a lot of work being done, both in the English and the Malay language, which I have access to. I also spend a lot of time in the prisons, interviewing detainees, especially in Indonesia. So I think it's a sum total of both. I have access to a lot of the radical groups which are supposedly behind many of these so-called terrorists in the region.
Why do you use those words, supposedly, and so-called terrorism?
Because I don't think one particular organization is the churner of terrorism or terrorists. I think radicalization is not a monopoly of one religion, or in the case of Islamist terrorism, which I'm focusing on, the West claims there's one particular school called Nguruki, based in Solo, is the primary source of terrorists in Indonesia and even Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Thailand. I don't think so. I think my work shows that many do come from there, but they come from everywhere, from every part of Indonesia. So to me, that school is just one of the many nodes in the rise of terrorism.
So where are the hotspots in Southeast Asia at the moment?
I think if you are looking at Southeast Asia, the Malay, Islamist kind of thing, Indonesia being the largest Muslim state in the world definitely is the headquarters. It always has been. Wahhabi, Salafism, Jihadism came there in 1802. The oldest in the region. I think the second one is Thailand, Philippines, because they had a hot insurgency there going on for more than 100 years. Malaysia have no major explosions, but because of their policies of open door policies, all kinds of groups find spaces there. In Singapore, we are basically a function of what's happening around our neighboring country, mainly Malaysia. We have terrorist groups which are affiliated to Malaysians and Indonesians rather than being a specific group based for Singapore.
Now, Singapore's a former British colony. How's that affected the way it's developed?
Oh, my God. The British left behind two major assets. One was super infrastructure. Number two was the civil service, plus the English language. I think the sum total of the two provided the basic wherewithal by which we allowed the government which came to power following the British withdrawal and which remains in power till today, that momentum which has made us one of the richest countries in the world.
So be honest, how democratic is it?
Fairly. I think what it used to be and what is today is a sea change. But I think that question, I'd like to reverse it. I think what Singaporeans want, I think my father couldn't be bothered about what is democracy. It was meaningless to him. For me, I would like to see more space. I think for my children, they are demanding more spaces. So I think there has been an evolution over time, and I think the government has responded in a very graduated fashion, knowing full well that Maslow is alive. After having given people basic needs, people want higher needs. And rather than being forced to give, they rather slowly give in one way or another. And I think the government has been quite responsive, especially in the last 15 years.
One of the big problems in the area is the relatively new Rohingya.
Actually, I've written a book on that. The title of my book is called Challenges Confronting a Persecuted Minority. The Rohingyas in Southeast Asia and Challenges for National, Regional and International Security. It's published by the Gajah Mada University Press in English and in Bahasa Indonesia. Look, the Rohingyas is a relatively recent problem in the sense that they were a legacy of British colonialism. The Rohingyas originated from what is a place called Chittagong in Bangladesh. But when the Brits were there, there was no such thing as Bangladesh, India or Pakistan. So what was called Burma was part of India. It was governed from Calcutta. So what the Brits did was fairly legitimate. Burma then needed labor and hardworking labor, and that hardworking labor was in abundance in Bangladesh. These guys came over after 1824, and especially after 1884 when the conquest of Burma was total, and they did a fantastic job. But as they became progressive over the years, the notion of identity crept up. This was partly in response to the rising nationalism in Burma, which was Buddhist-centric. So I think here you have got a nation being crafted in the name of Buddhism, and here you've got Muslims who felt, hey, who am I? And across from where they came from was so-called East Pakistan, and the Muslim League, which was also championing a kind of nationalism in Pakistan, or then about to become Pakistan, whereas in India it was Congress. So I think the Rohingya issue was a function of something broader which nobody talks about today. But then a number of things happened. Again, I blame the Brits fundamentally, because as the Japanese invaded Burma, just like they invaded Malaya, in the case of Malaya, the British decided to work with the Communist Party and they armed them and they trained them. In the case of Burma, as there was no other countervailing forces to the Japanese, they decided to arm the Rohingyas. And they created a force called V-Force of 100,000 Muslims. Now, because of prior to this, for the last 25 years, the tension between the Buddhists and the Muslims was so bad, and there were a couple of riots, targeted Indians in general. The Burmese made no difference between Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims. A lot of the Indians and Sikhs returned back, but the Muslims could not because they were the land-owning people. They were basically working as farmers. The moment they got the arms, lo and behold, they turned the arms against the Buddhists. And it led to massacre and counter-massacre. So what happened in 1941-42 is significant. People forget about that. That's one. So the legacy of that. Number two, the moment the war was over, the governing party emerging was a Buddhist-centric party led by Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San. Now, he was in no mood to see Burma split up. He was interested in a kind of a diversified, plural Burma, a plural society. Unfortunately, he was murdered. In the midst of all this, India emerging, things happening in Burma, the Rohingyas in Burma made a fundamental error. They established a group called the Mujahidins, something very familiar, Mujahidins, and they decided to fight for independence in what is known as Arakan. And when the Burmese said no, they decided to join Pakistan. They in fact sent a delegation to the Pakistani leader and said, we want to be part of East Pakistan and not part of Burma. And remember, both Pakistan and India and Burma got independence almost at the same time. Because of this, the Burmese have never ever forgiven nor forgotten this act of betrayal by the Rohingyas. What happened after that was basically through and through. But I think these two acts, the V-Force and this willingness to join East Pakistan, has been something the Burmese have never forgotten.
I mean, everybody knows in the Middle East the British Sykes-Picot Agreement created more problems than it solved. Sure. Do you think there was something similar going on in Southeast Asia?
I won't say along the same lines, because I think the sense of who is what and when and how was a bit clearer. Because in the case of the Middle East, there was this big Arab crescent. Whereas in Southeast Asia, I think it was a slightly different. We had a Malay world, what is in Malaya, which was under the British. The anomaly there was Singapore, which was mainly Chinese. Thailand was clear. Burma was clear. Was Burma part of India or Southeast Asia? I think it became very clear. Burma is going to be separate. Philippines was clear, the French Indo-Chinese colonies were clear, and Indonesia was under the Dutch, was very clear. So I don't think the British had a similar game plan, even though they did try to use centre-periphery, divide and rule policies, but contextualized to the Southeast Asian region.
In the wider context of the war on terror in the region, do you see solutions?
Look, I'm a scholar of terrorism. Intelligence, prostitution and terrorism are the three oldest professions in this world. I don't see terrorism ending. But I think terrorism can be diluted reduced somewhat if a couple of things happen. One, good governance in each and every state in the region. One of the reasons why people pick up arms and are prepared to die is not because of Al-Qaeda or IS or United States or whatever. I think they are cursing and swearing to the various manifold deprivations and repressions and suppressions, historically almost. So I think there's this big thing called good governance. Look, why aren't the Singaporeans revolting? Why? Because I think the going is very good. I think if tomorrow there's terrible bad governance in Singapore, if there's nothing else available, we may pick up arms. I won't be surprised, So I think if I look at the Indonesian situation particularly, corruption, repression, suppression, marginalization have become the DNA of the political structure and system there. So you ask these people what independence, and then they'll say, what are you talking about? And then on the other hand, there are enough entrepreneurs who want to exploit these for their own political purposes. And therefore, this become cannon fodder. So to me, governance and good governance is the key. Number two, our inability to cooperate in the region. Even if there are bad guys out there, we are not able to get our act together because we've got all kinds of problems. So national interest, while we talk a lot about cooperation, in terms of actuality, not much goes on. There's a political will which is the problematic here. I think the international environment is really, really ill-conducive and inconducive for this. In fact, it's conducive for the growth of terrorism. I think the Western powers are partly to be blamed for what they have done in different parts of the world, but mainly Middle East. I think the kind of conflicts between India and Pakistan, India and China have not helped terrorism, because this provides them with all kinds of spaces for people to play. I give you an example. China's anti-Muslim policy in Xinjiang. In Xinjiang, this is an area which is very, very rich, which is Muslim majority. The policy is repression. What do? I mean, I don't want to give up my faith and become a Han Chinese. I'm of Turk background. Islam has been my part of the religion for the 1,400 years. It became Islamic when the Prophet was still alive. Damn it, you want me to become a Chinese communist? No way. Muslim communist? Maybe. I'm not going to give up my religion. So I think that has created a problem. So today you find these guys going to IS, they join the Al-Qaeda, they go either over the land route or they come to Thailand and go up there. So export of Chinese extremism and terrorism because of what's going on there. Number two, the whole geopolitical mess in the Middle East is to be blamed on who? I think the Arab incompetence is partly a fault. I think the disparity between the rich and poor, despite the oil wealth, is partly a problem. But I think a lot of the great power conflict from the Cold War to the post-Cold War is also to be blamed. So I think there's no tour de force, there's no single factor. So for different people get motivated by different reasons, and then at the end of the day, you got one of these hell of a big global mess.
The flight capital network that happened after the Second World War with the Nazis' looted wealth from World War II. Am I right in thinking that you think that there's maybe something parallel went on with the Japanese in your part of the world? I think, look, the moment the war was over, the Axis powers in Germany and Japan, and they've got defeated, and both got tried. We have got the Nuremberg trials there. We had the Manilla trials in Southeast Asia. Following their hanging and execution, when the dust settled down, the next question was, hey, these guys took a lot of wealth from us. Where is the wealth? The hunt for that goal has been ongoing ever since, and we have never found the goal, Yamagata's goal in Southeast Asia. Is it with the government? Is it with the Japanese government? Is it with the American government? Is it still hidden underground? It's a question I do not dare to speculate, but I can tell you that issue has been raised, but there are no answers. I know there's a book, I know there's a film, but I wish I knew where it is. The Philippines has been suggested as a possible place.
I mean, if it's true that there's such a goal, and it's true that predators starting with capital P, where the banks were involved, then I think justice requires that we do something about it and hopefully return it to the rightful owners. Because I think it will make a hell of a difference in terms of development in this world with the amount of gold. Because if that gold belongs to the people, then how many 100 million people will benefit from such retrospective giving back of that wealth which is rightfully theirs. In fact, there's a similar question in Indonesia, that there is so much of gold which was taken by the Japanese, and because the Republicans collaborated with the Japanese, that they knew something about it. But up to today, we have never known. This is known as Sukarno's gold, for example. So there you go. So I mean, it gets complicated. I think the script gets much more complex, and each country have got its own little story. But you are right. Manilla was supposedly the place where this Japanese commander, because that's where they operated from, and eventually that's where they were executed. But if it's true it's there, then I think it should go back to the people for the betterment for all mankind.
Well, that's Professor Bilveer Singh there from Singapore University Political Science Department. Martin, just quickly, you got half a minute. What do you make of that?
Well, it was a very comprehensive view. I think what he was saying about the Chinese and Xinjiang in northern China, evidence recently come to light is that the bombing in Thailand of the Hindu temple was possibly carried out by Uyghur terrorists who are linked to the Turkish Grey Wolves, who are in turn linked to NATO's intelligence services.
Okay.
So that's one of the things I would say.
And I'll
about
put
that.
links to some of his work on our show page, thisweek.org.uk. It's time to sign off now for the Murdoch News at 7, our sister show Dialects on Tuesday at noon. Next week you can hear the full interview with care home survivor, now in the People's Tribunal channel. Call us. Thisweek.org.uk takes us straight to this show and our archives. I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable weekend. Please join us for the Politics Show at 5 next week, and don't let the banksters get you down.
Line and on your mobile. BCfm is an award-winning community